So, for example, I could have wonderful marketing, and I might even nick a few ideas from the therapist down the road, thinking, "Oh, that sounds good. I'll write that on my website." And then actually the client walks through the door and they sit down and we start talking, and what's been put on my website or whatever doesn't actually connect with who I really am as a person. Okay. Now, what this means is that it's going to be less likely that the client will then go on and work with you.
So hello everyone, I'm delighted today to welcome Kaz Binstead, she, her, who is a private practice counsellor, supervisor and a visiting lecturer. So I've known Kaz for a while, and I think we've talked before about when you set up the private practice toolkit for the BACP, haven't you? And that's like a really good resource that's out there for anybody who's in BACP, who's setting up in private practice. Sort of pulls together all the different resources that are available in one place, doesn't it? So, yeah. And the other way that I've come across Kaz is online because of Therapist Connect. So I don't know if you want to tell people a little bit about that, Kaz, about Therapist Connect, in case they haven't heard of it, but I expect they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really nice to be back, and we had a good old chat about the BACP Private Practice Toolkit last time. This book is kind of, I guess, the culmination of so much of my work in and with private practitioners, which, as you've said there, involves also my community work at Therapist Connect. And so Therapist Connect is a community platform. I mean, it kind of says it on the tin, what it's about, the name Connecting Therapists. But we've also been very interested from the start. We've run from 2020, which was obviously bang in the middle of the pandemic. So we've been very interested in getting conversations going about our profession, interested in, the evolution of our profession, interested in giving a voice to all therapists in a, non-discriminatory way in terms of who people are and also what spheres they work in within our profession. So yeah, it's been really lovely, and hello to anyone from the Therapist Connect community who happens to be listening.
Yeah, brilliant. That's fantastic. The other thing I've written down is, because I follow you on Instagram, and you're also known there as the Night Owl Counsellor, aren't you?
Yes.
And I think there might be a little reference in the book to the Night Owl. There's a bit, isn't there? Perhaps we can come back to that. And the other thing you do that I enjoy following is you're quite a keen photographer, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. I am.
And do you share like your pictures, don't you, and you reflect on what the meaning that the pictures bring to you?
Yeah, this is very important. I mean, I am a creative person, and I'm into I do lots of things. I like poetry, music, some other things, but photography is really my main thing at the moment, and it really means such a lot to me that you mentioned that, actually. So thank you. And yeah, I do. I put up photos, and I guess I put up my musings about life, and
I think I mean, I like them because it provides a nice sort of reflective moment in my social feed. So scrolling through, and then there's a picture from you and some sort of reflection around it, which is something I enjoy about following you. So how long have you been in private practice for, Kaz? I imagine it's quite a while now.
Yeah. I was just actually working it out. It's getting on for 13 years.
Wow.
So I've been in private practice since I qualified, which I didn't really ever plan to go into private practice. But because, as we all know, it can be quite difficult with the job sector. But even back then, it was difficult because there was an expectation that you would be accredited before you could get a job. And obviously that was kind of problematic if you qualified and you needed to work. And actually I had very close to 450 hours when I qualified, because I really worked very hard as a student. So I was kind of, I had a lot of experience. But I kind of fell into private practice and then just kind of muddled my way through and just worked everything out myself.
Yeah. As you did back then, because there wasn't a huge amount of, I think possibly, you and I are probably similar sort of time. I started in 2012, so around that sort of time. And, later on, they've introduced like a level 5 course, which they now say you should do before you go into private practice. But of course, that wasn't available when I went into private practice. And it really was a case of sort of working it out as you went along. And I was sort of quite lucky. I had a really great supervisor and mentor who helped me out at the start. And I was always grateful to her for some of the advice that she gave me. Did you have anybody to sort of help you, or was that supervision as well?
Not really. The placement that I had been working in had quite a good setup in that they ran the NHS service in our area, and they had a low cost service. So they would allow clients to move in order to stay with a therapist if they wanted to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that was how I got my first 3 clients, actually, because they let me take those clients from the low cost into my own very low cost private practice at that point. And then when I kind of realised, okay, well, if I'm going to have to do this for a bit, I didn't really have any mentor or anything. Obviously, I had my supervisor, but I really just worked everything out on my own. And I mean, I'm not, you talking there about my photography, I'm more of a creative person, so I'm not like, business, absolute kind of business brain going into things. But I also was very aware that you do have to run, you are running a business. So I kind of just found my own way to run it. I just kind of, I guess, tapped into who I was as an individual and worked it out from there. And then it was kind of my supervisor who later down the line had said to me, you do know that you've really got something here. You set this all up on your own. You're constantly full. I mean, I have, ever since I started, I've always been full. I've never dipped down what I would have wanted, the amount of people I would have wanted to see or needed to see. So that kind of led me to run my first course, which was years and years ago. And of course, like you were saying, back then, there wasn't really all the kind of the consultants and people like yourself and courses and stuff that we see today.
Really interesting. And I'm really sorry because I've sort of got carried away, and I forgot to say that actually you're here to discuss the book.
Yes, absolutely.
So I shall hold it up. Yeah, we'll hold it up and we'll get a picture of us both together. Yay!
Yeah.
So I was very lucky to get a review copy of Cassie's book, which is called Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice. And you have a joint co-author, don't you? And I'll let you say his name so I don't mispronounce it.
Yes, so I'm the first author on the book, and then the other author is Nicholas Sarantakis.
And can you tell us who the book is aimed at?
So I suppose first and foremost, I would have in mind people who are new to the sector. So students who are looking to go into private practice, and something I touch on in the book is the amount of preparation that you can actually do before you're qualified and before you've started private practice, and that preparation is actually very important. So definitely recommend it to students looking to go into private practice. Also those who are new to private practice, or if you're coming across from having worked in employment, because I do always say, and I know you would as well, Josephine, that private practice is a very niche sector, and that's why it's so important that actually we can think about what are some of those differences that come up. And of course, my specialist area, and really what led me into the toolkit work at BACP, was the fact that I was very interested in 2 avenues. So the ethics side of therapy, and actually the therapeutic work, and how that sits with the business side and growing your practice and private practitioners' needs, like things like money and stuff like that. So kind of looking at those 2 things together, having in mind, and this is my theory, which is the more ethical you are, the more sustainable your private practice is going to be.
Yeah, and I think that comes across really strongly in the book, and I think it's sort of like a theme throughout the book, which, again, I'd like to come back to in a little while, because I think it's a really, really important thing. I guess the thing that I really wanted... first of all, can you explain the 3-dimensional model that you use in the book?
And this 3-dimensional model is one of the things that, I think maybe really, or I hope will be useful, because it comes from, basically the 3 dimensions are the client, the private practitioner and their business, and then kind of social context. And the work I'd previously done had taken the first two. So obviously the client is always at the heart. I mean, that's in the ethical frameworks. The client is at the heart of the work.
Yeah.
But for me, to ignore the role of the private practitioner and the impact of working in the context of a private practice and a business, to ignore that would be to actually have ethical issues coming up. So it's almost like it's felt slightly taboo in ethics to say that anything other than that we think about anything other than the client. Of course, the client is first and foremost, but we have to think about these other factors in order to be ethical,
Absolutely.
to kind of bring them to the surface. So those two dimensions I'd already done a bit of work on. We added this third dimension, which is kind of other things that might have an effect. So things like our profession, and when they talk about bringing the profession into disrepute, or how does that factor? Or, community as a whole, working with difference and diversity, as we live in a world where everybody is different. How do we make sure that we're actually thinking about that, right down to the kind of the community of private practitioners themselves?
And I think sort of all these different themes come together in the book, don't they? And social media is another sort of part of it that you bring in and talk about, and I think a really nice focus on the person of the therapists themselves as well, because it's all part of that whole, isn't it? That we're not looking after the client in isolation, away from ourselves, away from our business, or away from sort of wider society. So I'm particularly interested to read at the start of the book your observations about the changing makeup of the profession, and I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people work in private practice now. The figure is almost 70% working in some capacity in private practice. That's a lot of people, and it's only going to get larger, I think. I think that figure is going to increase. But our profession in general is changing, So the demographic, for example, people who are training are kind of on the whole a lot younger than they were at one point. And those people quite rightly are coming into this profession expecting to train and to work, as of course you would. And we really owe it to those people, particularly if it's their first careers or whatever, to be able to say, right, okay, how are we going to help you in private practice? It's one of the reasons I felt so strongly, because I felt like not all trainings, but a lot of trainings, I mean, mainly because trainings are so full already, but they don't have the space to cover this subject, or if they do, they don't have the space to cover it in full. And yet there really is a lot that needs to be looked at. Of course, the work of the toolkit enabled, the largest membership body to look at it. But those private practitioners need to be supported, because the reality is that a lot of people are going to qualify, and whether people want to go into private practice or not, there is a real issue with a lack of jobs, a lack of paid jobs available, which is very sad for our profession, I think. But it is the reality of things.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of sad for sad for our community as well. I mean, not community, I mean, society. There isn't enough funding for therapy, I don't think, because I think we all know what a huge difference it would make if there was more therapy available to people in all sorts of walks of life. So, I mean, I was sort of thinking, reading what you'd said about the fact that the profession is changing. I'm the mum of 20 and 30-somethings. The older ones are a little bit more established now, but the one that's sort of in their middle 20s, it's such a struggle. It's a different profession, but very similar, I think, in that, you prepare for a job and then you graduate, and then there's sort of really nothing there. And I was really struck by a comment we had from a young woman in the Good Enough Counsellors Facebook group recently, where she said, this is almost breaking me. She's 26. She's doing obviously a really big, long course. It sort of sounds like it's a proper sort of in-depth psychotherapy course, and is doing her placement. And she said having to pay for supervision is just absolutely crippling her. That £120 a month is just really difficult. It's really difficult to find work where she can work around the requirements of her placement as well. And I just think it's such a problematic thing, I think, for our profession, that, this is what's happening, isn't it, to people? And I think, I don't know about you, but I mean, my daughter's, attempting to set herself up as a freelancer. And I think it's quite a difficult thing to do when you're in your 20s. I mean, I found it difficult enough to do in my 50s, let alone,
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine me at that sort of age in my middle 20s having the courage to set myself up as a freelancer, as a private practitioner. What do you sort of hear? Because I know you work with the student community quite a lot. What sort of things do you hear from them about sort of getting set up and what it's like as a young person?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that. And really, Josephine, I think because of the work that you do in your Facebook group, you've really got your ear to the ground. And it's people like you that need to be listened to, because actually this is the reality. And I think that's why I felt very strongly about this work, because I've become very well known, but I do still run a full private practice. That's what I do day in, day out. I still do it. So I don't feel, I may be more well known than other private practitioners or whatever, but I don't feel detached from them. I feel very much like, this is the reality. People are really, really struggling. It's really sad to hear stories like that sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think even more sad if we bring other things that are happening in our profession where therapists feel even more devalued. I'm not going to talk about scope today, but we both know that's what I meant, what I'm talking about. So I think that, groups like yours are really important. To give that sense of camaraderie and support and things. But I do wish that our profession, it's quite a hierarchical profession in itself. And ironically, the people who are out there trying to help people and, doing our work, and like during the pandemic, working day in, day out, like a key worker. We're not key workers. We're the people that are really holding everything, and we deserve that recognition. And all the people that can't get jobs and find it difficult to set up private practices, they deserve help with that. They deserve help from the profession. I've done my bit, but there's only so far I can go with that. I hope that the book will help people, because I guess I normally see people struggle in two ways with private practice. Either they'll be like really, really excited and be like, I'm going to set my private practice up straight away and I'm going to have so and so amount of clients, or people will be really, really scared. And kind of, you need a bit of both. You need confidence in private practice, but you need to also be realistic about the time that it takes to do the preparation work, to do the setup. And you need to also bear in mind that you are both a therapist and a business person. So again, some people get very excited by the marketing side of things and the growing your practice, and that's all they're ever looking for. Yes, of course, you're going to get people through the door, but you need more than that in order to have a kind of sustainable practice.
Yeah. What sort of things do you mean, Kaz?
So, for example, I could have wonderful marketing, and I might even nick a few ideas from the therapist down the road, thinking, "Oh, that sounds good. I'll write that on my website." And then actually the client walks through the door and they sit down and we start talking, and what's been put on my website or whatever doesn't actually connect with who I really am as a person. Okay. Now, what this means is that it's going to be less likely that the client will then go on and work with you.
And use retention, isn't it?
Exactly. And we don't talk about retention enough, because, again, it's like one of those things where we're not supposed to talk about it, because, of course, we have to be ethical and not be wanting clients to stay. We want clients to be better. But the fact of the matter is, people are seeking therapy because they want therapy. And if they come to you for an initial session, it's much better if you've actually been able to be as honest as you can.
Before we continue, I just want to quickly share something for any of you who might be struggling to express what makes you unique as a therapist. If you find it hard to know what to say on your profile or your website that really connects you with the clients that you want to work with, I've got a special offer for you. In Therapy Growth Group, I'm launching a program in February that will help you identify exactly how to describe the way that you help people. We'll start with a clear, step-by-step, week-by-week process that culminates in a profile writing week from February the 24th. During this week, you'll get the chance to do a short exercise on various days to help you build out parts of your profile, and you'll get personalised feedback from me on these aspects of your profile, and also you'll be supported by other group members. This is a chance for you to make sure that what you say will truly resonate with clients and it will reflect who you are as a therapist. If that sounds helpful, please come and join me and the other members of Therapy Growth Group to really work on and enhance your profile. Just go along to josephinehughes.com/therapy-growth-group-offer to read more about it. And now back to Kaz.
Also consider things like whether you're working within your competency level. Now, by that, I mean not just can you actually work with something. It might be, can you work with something, or do you not quite know enough about it? Or it might be that you might not want to work with something. And I think that as private practitioners, there's a lot to think about in terms of who we are as private practitioners. And in a way, that kind of stuff and being settled in that kind of stuff needs to come before the marketing, as well as the contract. The contract is I'm so boring. It's like my favorite thing, because I'm one of those, super detailed people. But it is very, very important in private practice. And, contracts don't have to remain static throughout your private practice. It's not like you do one and then you just say, oh, that's it, I'm stuck with that for the next 20 years. You can, obviously, as new clients come along, if you want to make updates later down the line, of course, but actually being able to really think about your contract and your boundaries and how you run your practice is super important, because you're going to come across as much more professional, like you know what you're doing, and you want to feel like therapists always want to feel like their clients will want to feel like they're in safe hands.
Absolutely.
They may not trust you straight away, they may not feel safe straight away, but there's got to be that kind of potential there.
I think it's really interesting because I'm not a details person at all, so I think we probably differ on that. I mean, when I started as well, just sort of thinking about it, I didn't have a written contract at that point. It wasn't sort of almost. The very few people did seem to have written contracts at that point. I think at some point I started delving a bit more into BACP guidelines and thought, perhaps I should have a written contract. And I think it's quite interesting, actually, because I think, again, the profession has changed. We have got, now I think hardly anybody would consider only having a verbal contract. Most people would have a written contract, and most people would probably get the client to sign it, see it beforehand. I remember sending mine out beforehand, and that was actually quite unusual when I first started doing it. It was almost like people didn't do anything until you actually got the client in front of you. So it has developed, hasn't it, over time,
Definitely.
I think we've got maybe more, I don't know if that's being more risk averse, I don't know, anyway. But
I remember Rory from Counselling Tutor a few years ago saying to me, it used to just be, get a room and a couple of chairs and you're all good, you know.
Yeah, that's it.
And I think that was, I guess, indicative, again, of the demographic change, because a lot of people, I guess because perhaps it was their second or third careers, they were of a certain demographic, they may not have needed to work so much. Whereas, actually, this is one of the reasons why now, and I guess continuing in the future, really looking at the private practice field and, kind of paying attention to all of this stuff is super important. It's important for clients, it's important for private practitioners, and it's important for the profession.
Yeah. Because I think I absolutely, don't get me wrong, absolutely agree with you that to have a clear idea is so helpful, because it not only helps the client, but it also helps us relax as well, because we know, what we're doing. We've got that sort of safe framework around us that we've thought through some of these things. Although I have to say, I think people do really struggle sometimes in setting their policies, but then actually when it comes to it, I'm thinking cancellations here, and this is something that you do talk about in the
Yes.
book,
Yeah.
because this is where the business side and the client side can really sort of come into it, can't it?
Of course, there are ethical things we have to consider in running our private practices. So there are some things that are kind of almost like, yeah, that is kind of how you have to do it. But the cancellation policy is not one of them. You can, if you set a cancellation policy that is ridiculous, I don't know, like 2 weeks or something, you're probably not going to get clients staying. So that wouldn't be advisable, I wouldn't think. But, you can set it at whatever you want to set it at. But the most important thing is that you communicate it and that you are consistent with it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the areas which really private practitioners can get in a bit of a sticky situation with.
Definitely. I honestly, Kaz, I mean, the number of times I've taken my cancellation policy to supervision, because I've struggled with it so much. And I think it's that sort of caring side of you that sort of thinks, yeah, they're ill, or their child's ill, or, what do I do in this situation? But then, you're making your policy up on the fly, I think. And like you say, it's important to have that consistency. So it's sort of fair across the board, really, which is an ethical sort of approach, really, isn't it? So, but honestly, I would say that actually cancellations is the thing. I collate every week. I collate the main things that come up in Good Enough Counsellors. And there's almost always something on cancellations every week. I think it's something we really struggle with as a profession, because it's very difficult, because it's that intersection between our income, our livelihoods, and the clients. I mean, someone said to me this morning that the client accused her of being, unprofessional over a cancellation policy. But, it's one of those things we have to have in place, really, isn't it? So...
Yeah, definitely. And the reality is that for private practitioners, this is one of the areas that complaints can be put in against you for. So that's why it's so important. There is stuff in the book if people want to read up on this. And it's also one of the reasons that I say have a written contract as opposed to a verbal one, because then, you can kind of come back to it. And if there is a bit of a dispute about something, you can use that contract as a way of kind of coming back together and saying, right, okay, well, what is it we've agreed in the beginning? But yeah, kind of flakiness around boundaries with cancellation policies is really, for what may seem like an easy life for you, you might think, oh, I'll just let it go this one time. Okay, easy life for me, until it happens another 2 times, and then you kind of feel a bit annoyed. So you're like, I'm going to enforce it now. But then there's an inconsistency, and you can see why that would really look very strange and unfair to the client. So it's things like that can be quite problematic.
And just to say at this point that, with this sort of scenario, you illustrate it with vignettes, don't you, though? So and as with any ethical book, you don't actually say to people, this is the answer.
Yes.
Which can be really frustrating, because often that's what you want. You want someone to tell you, right, this is the right thing to do and this is the wrong thing to do. But in fact, you don't do that in the book, do you? It's very ethical in that, here's you, it's your practice. These are the things to sort of really, you really sort of get people to just start thinking, don't you, about what this would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely packed full of vignettes and exercises. And definitely, because ethics isn't black and white. So there may not always be an answer. Sometimes there is. There, like there's stuff like, stuff in the chapter which is around policies and procedures other than the contract. Like I talk about clinical will, and I'm very clear there, it's kind of non-negotiable. A lot of people don't have them and haven't had them, but, it really ought to be. If you're working ethically, it really ought to be something that you have. So there are times when I'm kind of saying, yes, absolutely do that, or strongly consider this. But other times it's kind of what's been most important for me in writing this book is almost like a guidance for people to be able to think through these ethical dilemmas. I guess because I've got quite a creative mind, and because I am detailed as well, it's been a case of kind of giving a vignette and then going through absolutely every little point that may not be absolutely obvious. So I think, and you see this in when people come in with their hypothetical scenarios or whatever in Facebook groups, and they're trying to get a blanket answer, and it's like, well, well, it's not going to be a blanket answer. It's going to be dependent on a lot of things. But you're more likely to get to an answer if you actually reflect on certain things. And there are certainly, with some aspects of our work, some very common reflections that will take place.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a real theme that comes through the book. And I think this sort of like, quite a lot of the chapters I was picking up on it. And this is about the isolation of the profession. And I think that's a really important part of what you talk about, isn't it? Would you like to sort of tell us a bit more about how, working as a private practitioner, you think impacts the practitioner?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, the amount of years I was doing this role, and I guess at first I knew people in the area and stuff, and then and you got your kind of the people that you trained with, and then everyone moves away, and it was when I was started Therapist Connect with Peter Blundell, I guess then I began talking to more therapists than I had like ever. And it really came to mind for me just how isolated I was. And, this is a reality of private practice. Now, it's isolation in two ways. So it's physical isolation because you're working on your own and you don't, you might be seeing, say, 6 clients in a day and you can't go home and talk about your work because of confidentiality. But you also don't have colleagues to kind of even just go in the kitchen and say, oh, how's your day going today? This kind of thing, unless you work in a building with other therapists, you'll be very much holding that yourself.
Yes.
And that really does actually take its toll.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I guess this was why, again, why the support for private practitioners is very important, and private practitioners getting things like their policies and procedures and contracts and stuff right is because I refer in the book to this kind of absence of, I think I talked about it in a BACP paper first, actually. So I've referenced myself about this absence of scaffolding.
Yeah.
So, and students are really going to feel this, but therapists in general who've been working in organisations or agencies, there's always someone else. It's like you've got okay, so you may have a clinical supervisor, everyone has a clinical supervisor, but then you've got like a placement manager maybe, and then there's like a clinical director, and then there's like a clinical manager. And so if an ethical issue comes up, there's lots of people that you can perhaps refer something tricky, refer on to. But as a private practitioner, you don't have any of that, and you haven't got anybody else creating those policies and things. So it's very much you on your own, holding all of that as well. And so coming back to, you're worrying about your cancellation policy, haven't got it right. You're doing that in isolation, which can just be really, really hard. And it can be hard as time goes on. Like you may just get into a thing and then just think, oh, I might as well take on more clients and fill your days. And yet actually lose, who you are as a person, lose that there's other things in life other than therapy, and actually applying self-care. And of course we know burnout is much more susceptible to private practitioners.
I thought that was a really lovely chapter actually that you wrote. There's a chapter on supervision and alternative sources of support, and I found that because the subtitle of the book is Solidarity, Compassion and Justice, and I felt that particular chapter was very, very compassionate towards sort of private practitioners and how the sort of pressures and strains that they might be under. And I can definitely sort of identify with what you're saying, because when I first started working, I'd rent a room, but I was working on my own in that room, and then I worked from home. And it's that, like you say, it's just that lack of the sort of water cooler moments, just a colleague to say, hey, did you watch Celebrity Come Dining or whatever? with somebody, and just have those little chats during the day. And you can end up that you're very deep in relationship with the people that you're listening to, but there's no one there for you almost when you're working sort of on your own day in, day out. What changed it for me was working in an office with other therapists, and quite often someone being around. It was just really nice that you could sit down and have a chat with somebody, or just see them in passing. It did give me a real extra dimension to my practice at that point. So I was very lucky like that. But I think that sort of recognition that if people are going to be doing this job for a long time, they need to attend to that isolation, don't they? They need to find ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's great for you that you had that. And I would really strongly recommend people find different ways that they can make those connections. So, like for us, we have social media communities and stuff. But, you might also need different kinds of connections, because social media only provides one source of connection. So it might be important for you to find other therapists in your area, or even if you make friends online, can you kind of make that into like a real life friendship? I mean, I know a few people, and I met them online in 2019, and now we kind of just have a offline proper friendship. Not that I'm saying online friendships aren't proper, but you know what I mean.
It's nice to see someone in real life.
Like this Thursday, so I finish my work on Wednesday, and on Thursday I'm going out with 2 other therapists in the area for a Christmas dinner.
Lovely.
A Christmas party dinner, because that's something that is like something that every year when it comes, I'm like, oh, I don't get a work Christmas party. So I was absolutely determined this year to make sure I did something with some therapists.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really important, because it's just sort of like, you just are on your own otherwise. And I think it sort of creeps in, really, doesn't it? You don't realise that it's happening, but you are becoming more and more isolated, and that can be problematic. So what would your advice be to therapists to prevent burnout, do you think?
Oh, well, there's loads. I mean, there's actually that thank you for saying that chapter was a nice chapter, because for me, it felt good writing it as well. Yeah, I put a list in there actually, which is a lot. It's a long list, and it was really interesting for me to think about that question, kind of what prevents burnout, and also what do you do when you feel that it's coming on? Because often we talk about those 2 points before burnout and then once burnout's hit, but we don't talk about the kind of the transition points.
And I think that was a really interesting point that you made there, because again, it's using a vignette, isn't it? And it's somebody who's got this successful private practice and beginning to feel those symptoms of burnout, but to admit that she's maybe getting burnout when everybody perceives her to have a successful private practice is difficult. So that was sort of one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it as well was obviously the income side of it, that what can you do? And that's sort of something that you actually addressed in that list of points as to what to do about it, wasn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. And definitely, I mean, thank you for pointing those 2 things out that came up in the vignette, because they are really real things for private practitioners. And even people feel a sense of shame sometimes admitting to their supervisors even that, and that's why it's really good for supervisors to kind of be looking for the signs, so that you don't have to use the word burnout if you're a supervisor, but you might just say, how are you doing? How balanced is your life? So definitely check that list out, because, basically if you burn out, it is a real thing. Private practitioners do burn out. But if you burn out, you then can't work. So it's, and you may not, I mean, I was speaking to a therapist more recently who burnt out and she couldn't work for over 3 years.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So, it may not be that long, but it will be a period that you won't be able to work. And so actually it's much better to kind of, even though it's difficult, to just stay on track of that and see where you're at with that as you go along in your career.
And I think here that, I mean, you do mention it briefly sort of elsewhere in the book about the importance of, again, coming back to fees, and that, because I mean, there's sort of 2 ways that you can make your private practice work. You can charge more, or you can see more clients. And I think often, because of our reluctance to charge higher fees, is that we might choose to see lots of clients. I know for me, it was a real breakthrough moment when I actually put my prices up. But the thing that happened as a result of actually putting my prices up was I thought, oh, blimey, I can see fewer people and still have the same amount of money. And that actually was really helpful at that point in my life. It had a lot going on, so, yeah.
And it
Interesting.
makes sense because if you go along and you work over 10 years as a private practitioner, you do get, I mean, I feel, I don't know about you, Josephine, I don't know if you still do see clients actually, but I feel more tired than I did when I first started, just because I'm older and I've been doing it for a long time. So actually, it just makes sense that as you go along, you become more experienced. And with more experience, it doesn't make you a better therapist necessarily, but you do have more
Yeah.
experience. So you are entitled to put your fees up. Like you say, a lot of clients actually don't have an issue with that. As long as you've done it, yeah, we worry about it more than they might. As long as you've done it in a kind of a
Ethical.
respectful way,
Yeah.
you've thought about how to communicate it, how much notice you're giving. It's not some ridiculous amount that you're putting it up. And of course, if you put fees up more regularly, then that will be much more palatable as
Yeah.
well. And like you say, then what that means is that when you do get to a point where you're like, oh, I feel a bit more tired these days, you can then see less clients, but
Yeah.
you can carry on working.
Yeah.
So it really does make
Yeah, I
sense.
think so. I think so. I think it's. I mean, and for a while, to be honest, I did get stuck as well because I put them up for new people, but over time, the people who had kept on the same rate, they fell such a long way behind that was actually became problematic as too. So I think as well, although it's hard to put them up for existing clients, my experience was that probably I should have done that as well at the same time. So yeah, and I know people vary on whether or not they want to do that, but I think for me, especially for the longer term clients, so I had someone 50 and someone 35, and that was a big gap at that point, So yeah, it's just something else to think about, really. So coming back to sort of burnout and support for people, you talk in the book about social media as well, don't you? I mean, there's a whole sort of section on marketing and ethical marketing, which you probably won't have time to talk about, but you do actually talk about the impact of social media on therapists in terms of their connection as well, which I thought was quite an interesting section on the ways that sometimes it might be less helpful than we may imagine. I don't know if you want to say any more about that.
Yeah, it was so nice to include this chapter on social media because, it's not really there's not a lot written on therapists' use of social media. And, obviously because I am a community lead on social media, it felt really important to have it there. And it was great to do this. We kind of involved private practitioners and we had a round table, which was great in terms of hearing different perspectives as to why people use social media, which was very different between practitioners and what they were expecting out of it, and also how we thought about the boundaries around that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's some interesting things in there around, like you were saying there, how people are on social media. So on the surface, we might say a blanket statement, which is social media and Facebook groups like yours and communities like mine are a good thing because they connect people together. But then, of course, there's the other side of it.
There's a shadow side to it, isn't there?
Shadow side to it, yeah, absolutely. And this was very interesting for me really throughout the book, the kind of how we are with other private practitioners and how what we bring in ourselves as people, and how we can be, I don't know, like, it's not like we're going to be friends with everybody because we're not, but what could actually make people feel like, oh, actually I feel less connected now, or I feel less inclined to be in like a Facebook group or something like that.
I thought that was a really interesting insight because you said at one point, people reach out for support, and I've seen this happen, and then they get castigated, and that is the antithesis really of support, isn't it? And I think often, we can get these, it's a bit like process groups really. Sometimes in process groups there's a whole load of unspoken rules, and it's all right as long as you know what those unspoken rules are, but if you don't, then you're in trouble. And I think it can be like that on social media, in that there's a lot of sort of ways you're supposed to be, and people can not realise that, and then they can get into trouble.
Yeah.
As someone
absolutely.
who does put my foot in it occasionally. I do know, and I think that's quite hard, and especially if you're just starting out, I think that can be actually a really difficult thing to navigate.
And it's like, for me, it's like, I mean, this is talked about as well in that chapter, which is about the role of social media and therapists versus like supervision. And for me, it's actually being able to be clear about what is useful for people to take to the supervision space, and then what, like these kinds of questions, what could be really useful if, it's just like, oh, actually, here's a practical question and I just don't know how to answer it.
It's going to say it's a really, I think this, people knowing what they should take or what they can take to supervision as opposed to what they can put on social media. And I know sort of like I've worked with my previous supervisor quite a lot on this, running the group, and her sort of view, she's very sort of not really into social media, but very much sort of like, well, why would someone put that in a group? Why isn't it going to supervision? And I think sometimes, if I'm really honest, what can happen is that people, something will happen in their practice and they're in that sort of like almost, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do about it. And they'll come on social media and they'll post a question. And when you actually say to them, actually, I think this might be something to discuss in supervision, quite often they'll say, yeah, I was just feeling a bit shocked and so I posted, which I think is why, one of the advantages of Facebook groups, if you've got your post-approval turned on, you have got that moderation facility. So yes. we can pick it up in moderation, but it can also be quite difficult sometimes. I find this as a moderator, is you want to help people and you sort of see something come up and you're thinking, oh, is this saying too much? Is this, like you were saying about hypothetical situations? Is it really hypothetical, or is this? Yeah, it's so difficult.
Because I really get it. I mean, I feel as a therapist, a working therapist, I get it. I get it when you've had a client and you're full of everything.
Yeah.
And all you want to do is blurt it out or do something with it or get it out of you or whatever, because it may be something really heavy from the client, or it may be that something's happened between you and the client and you're worried. But I guess for me that's an ethical thing. That is one of our professional responsibilities, confidentiality. And so we have to find ways to be able to, work with our supervisor. I mean, for example, both my supervisors, they offer emergency support if needed.
Yeah.
So they may not be able to speak to me straight away, but I can send them a text and say, oh, something really, I don't really need that too much these days, but when I first started in those first few years, that was just great to have that facility, but I think that actually if you can really think about the different support systems that you have and how you're going to use them, then that can help you all round. Because actually if you're dealing with your stress in general and having ways so that you're not feeling so isolated, which might be more general chit chat in groups like yours or asking about the practical things, then you may be less, you may be, there may be more space to breathe, if you like.
A bit more regulated, really.
Yeah.
Because you've got that connection, because connection helps us regulate, doesn't it? So, yeah. Oh, it's so fascinating. I've got loads more I could talk to you about, but I'm sort of aware of the time ticking by, so I think we better finish there. But it's been so interesting to hear your thoughts, and congratulations on the book. I've really enjoyed reading it. It's got lots there, I think there's a sort of lot I learned just sort of generally, sort of, for me, I think a bird's eye view of sort of professional issues and what it's like for people. Found it quite a refreshing read, actually, to sort of, from that point of view and thinking about how the profession is changing and the needs of younger members of the profession as well. And, almost, what we need to do to try and address the gaps. I don't know what the answer is, but, the more we talk about things, the more likely we are to come up with some sort of solution, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is talking about it, and it is, allowing people's lived experience to be heard as well. Yeah. Oh, thank you for having me on. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I imagine probably, hopefully, just the fact that you're saying that you've been full since you've started and have always run a full private practice will actually encourage people who are listening as well. Yeah. Because I think often, I had someone recently in the group who said, is it possible to make a living from private practice? So it's always really good to hear from people who are making a living, who have made it work. So thank you for that as well.
You're welcome. It definitely is possible,
good
listeners.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Kaz. That's really great.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thanks for listening. Do come and join my Facebook community, Good Enough Counsellors. And for more information about how I can help you develop your private practice, please visit my website, josephinehughes.com. If you found this episode helpful, I'd love it if you could share it with a fellow therapist or leave a review on your podcast app. And in closing, I'd love to remind you that every single step you make gets you closer to your dream. I really believe you can do it.